Yeah, in our next talk, Jack will be talking about applying SciML to ecological systems.
Yeah, right on. Thank you so much. All right, yeah, well, thanks for those of you who are here. I appreciate having some audience. The goal of this talk is, I'm an ecologist by background and training, so me and my group have been getting really interested in trying to think about some of these tools that have been developed more in the machine learning and computer science worlds can be applied into our realm. And so rather than doing a lot of really technical details, I'm mostly gonna be talking about how we're thinking about these problems with the goal of maybe having some sort of transfer learning back, because there are some features of the data sets and problems we've been working on that have required some modifications of these tools. So I'm sort of reporting in from a larger group of primarily ecologists that have been working on this in a working group. And so mostly gonna be talking about work that I've led, but also there's stuff from this wide group of co-authors. And yeah, Chris isn't here, but he was actually pretty helpful at the very early stages of sort of conceptualizing some of the big picture ideas in this project. And yeah, we have like two big picture goals that the group's been thinking about. One is trying to explore how these sort of new scientific machine learning tools can be applied in our discipline, and to sort of modify and tailor them to deal with some of the specific issues that we face. And then we're also trying to write software to make these more accessible to people in our field. So this package, UniversalDiffEq, is in Julia. It's trying to have a relatively simple to use front end on top of some of the sort of SciML ecosystem. And then we're also trying to export functions from that into the R programming language, which is a lot more common, commonly used. So the idea is get some of the functionality out of Julia into something where people are already doing a lot of their data processing and management. So the big picture question that's motivating all this work is a relatively simple one, which is we want to understand how ecological systems are changing over time. So that could be things like the coral reef and sort of savanna that I've shown here. And this is I think, important question to be thinking about for a number of reasons. One is if we can understand these sort of patterns of ecological change, particularly in the face of climate change, we can do things like identify more effective strategies for conserving biodiversity or managing natural resources. We can help people that are dependent on natural resources plan and adapt to changing environments. And there's also lots of fun and interesting basic science questions that can be helped out significantly by understanding how ecosystems are changing over time, such as what factors are contributing to the distribution and abundance of different species, as well as some basic science questions about evolution. However, this is a fairly complex problem, or difficult problem to understand and solve, because ecological systems often exhibit complex dynamics. And to sort of formally define what complex dynamics are, it's essentially when simple interactions between ecosystem components produce complex emergent behaviors at the sort of population or system level. So a sort of canonical example of this would be relatively simple trophic interactions, like a predator-prey interaction between species, can produce sort of cycling population dynamics over time. And these patterns of change can become more complicated, so theoretical models can show that if you add an additional species into that analysis and you have a food chain rather than that sort of mutual pair, you can get unpredictable sort of chaotic dynamics. And there are other patterns that are quite important as well. So for example, a lot of species will modify their environment sort of locally in ways that support their own persistence. And this can create positive feedback loops that result in sort of nonlinear shifts in ecosystem states over time. So how do we understand and predict the behavior of these sort of complex dynamical systems? One option is to try to predict patterns directly from processes. So this would be having an understanding of what's going on in the biology and then using mathematical models to pick up on what those sort of high-level emergent properties may be. And then the other approach is to try to infer processes directly from patterns. So we have a time series and we fit a model to it. There's some serious limitations, though, with these approaches. So one issue with this predicting patterns from processes is that small errors in mechanisms can lead to really large errors in predictions, particularly when there is sort of strong nonlinear sort of feedbacks involved. Another thing that can happen is that sort of patterns can be, oftentimes patterns will be able to be explained by many different possible mechanisms. And in particular, in ecological systems, which is where I focus at, the dynamics of the system are quite slow. So we can't just run an experiment hundreds of times. if we want to understand patterns of change over half a century, it's going to take 50 years to get the data set. And so we have to be able to deal with these sort of essentially fairly limited information available just from this sort of time series data perspective. And so the goal, I think, behind the work our group has been doing is trying to sort of synthesize these multiple ways we can learn about ecosystems. So we have sort of observational type studies of those sort of high-level patterns that we can try to train models on, and we also have mechanistic information from biologists doing sort of field experiments. And we think these scientific machine learning tools can be a way of synthesizing these two sources of information to get a better understanding of the systems that we study. And there's a lot of different scientific machine learning tools that we think can be used to potentially get at this. So things like physics-informed neural networks do this by incorporating sort of mechanistic information into the loss function when you're training the models. There's also methods called knowledge-guided machine learning, which will train models on output from simulated data, from mechanistic models, from simulated data to incorporate mechanisms, and then train them on empirical data. And then the methods that we've been really focusing on are universal differential equations. And the idea is here we just build mechanisms directly into the model structure. And so this is the main thing that we've been focusing on. I have a brief overview on this. I mean, I'm sure you guys know well what's going on here. But the basic idea is a universal differential equation is some differential equation describing a change in a state variable x. And it's got a neural network embedded somewhere on the right-hand side. It's often an additive relationship, but it could be something more arbitrary. And that the nature of this function is going to encode sort of mechanistic information and physical constraints. And the neural network term can learn sort of unknown components of the system or sort of unknown functions in that are sort of embedded in that system's dynamics. A sort of great example, this would be sort of a local Volterra model. So this is describing that sort of predator-prey interaction I was describing at the beginning. There's a term for the growth of the prey population, orange term that describes the predation, and then a sort of mortality rate term as well. And as an example, you could replace, if you didn't know or you thought there was a more complicated relationship going on in this sort of predation term, that could be replaced with a neural network. So based on that, we had a few different research questions that we've been exploring. So one question that we've been thinking about is trying to understand what the best methods for training universal differential equations are, given the sort of the challenges and limitations of the time series data that we have available to us in our field. We also want to understand, so ecological systems can exhibit lots of different types of complex emergent phenomenon. So they're, at least particularly in a time series context, there are systems that will exhibit sort of oscillating dynamics, sort of unpredictable chaotic dynamics, as well as sort of nonlinear responses to external factors called regime shifts. And so we want to understand when are these methods going to help us across these different types of dynamics that we might be interested in studying. And then we also want to understand, like, does it actually help to incorporate biological mechanisms, or should we just be training really flexible models like a node instead of a UDE? So to kind of go after that first question, one of the big issues we had when we started trying to work with these methods is that time series data in ecology tend to be quite noisy. And as I said before, they tend to be relatively limited. So we don't have a nice sort of engineering physical system that we can put oscilloscopes on in different places and really figure out what's going on. So we often have data sets that have strong patterns of nonlinear change. So for example, a regime shift, which is occurring in the middle of this time series, driven by sort of biological feedback mechanisms. But we also see a lot of variability driven by sort of external factors that we don't necessarily observe perfectly. So there's lots of variability at the beginning of this time series that's well known to be caused by certain sort of variability in climate. And sometimes things are just hard to observe. So we also have sort of variability that's just due to noise in the observation process. And so one of the things that we've done is working on being able to deal with these sources of observation and measurement error when training universal differential equations. And so something we've done to make them more robust to these forms of uncertainty is embed them within a state space modeling formulation. And I'm not going to go into huge details about how that's done mathematically, but essentially what we try to do is, while we're training the model in the loss function, we use a probabilistic model that accounts for those sources of uncertainty. And as a sort of a benchmark, we've done a couple comparisons with other alternative methods for training UDE models. So one that I'm calling sort of a shooting method, where you just simulate trajectories of the ODE and you compare that to the data. And a gradient matching approach, where you fit a smoothing curve to the data, and then you train the model by matching the derivatives of the smoothing curve to the derivatives of the ODE model. And we've done some more extensive benchmarking than this, but these are the ones I'm going to present results for. And yeah, so one of the reasons we're interested in this is because sometimes we'll get data sets that look like this. So this is a data set simulated from a 3-species sort of food web model that exhibits chaotic dynamics with just a little bit of observational noise and sort of process noise added in, so a little bit of stochasticity. And what we end up getting are these highly variable time series data sets that are quite challenging for like smooth fitting functions and just simulating trajectories of the differential equations. And so we trained a bunch of models on different simulated data sets, simulating the random numbers differently to figure out the sampling error. And we trained these sort of UDE models with the 3 different approaches. We have sort of 2 different formulations for the state space modeling framework. And then we have the sort of gradient matching and shooting methods. And then the 4 different panels just show different levels of sort of noise added into the data set. And the x-axis is different forecasting horizons. And this was repeated hundreds of times on different simulated data sets. And we found that very consistently having this more explicit mathematical representation of the uncertainty made the model training process a lot more robust to the common types of uncertainty in our field, at least for this system. We also ran these on a different time series that had, so instead of that sort of highly variable, almost oscillating type dynamics, we looked at a system that had periodic regime shifts. So there are strong nonlinear dynamics internal to the system that can cause it to flicker between alternative stable states. And that's driven by some variable abiotic conditions. And again, we use sort of a forecast, we use simulation tests to look at the forecasting skill of the same universal differential equations trained with different methods. And in this case, this sort of gradient matching approach was the most effective, but the state space models were, in some cases, within the margin of error on our simulation analysis, so performing quite similarly. So this was like sort of one of the big first challenges. Like, this is allowing us to actually test these models and use them on sort of empirical data sets for environmental systems. And to answer my sort of motivating question here, what's the best method for training these models? It seems like it's a bit problem dependent. The state space model formulation is probably the most robust to uncertainty, but it adds quite a bit of computational cost. And since I'm not primarily a computer programmer, our code could probably be written a little more efficiently. And sort of gradient matching technique is probably the lowest computational cost because you avoid all the ODE solvers entirely in the sort of training process, which helps quite a bit. And the shooting method can be really nice in some cases because it restricts the solutions sort of predicted by the model to solutions of a differential equation, which kind of adds some regularization. But in general, with these highly uncertain data sets, embedding UDEs within a state space model helped a lot. Yeah, and within our sort of modeling, within this sort of software package we've been putting together, we have a relatively simple interface to access all these different methods, this train function. Oops. The next big set of questions and problems we looked at was trying to understand how well universal differential equations could identify and forecast regime changes in particular from time series data in ecology. And regime changes are essentially when small changes in external factors in the environment lead to large and persistent changes in the structure, so the types of species that are around, and the function, the types of ecosystem services that are produced by an ecosystem. And some examples of that include in like tropical nearshore ecosystems, reefs can be dominated either by corals or sort of macroalgae, and that depends a bit on temperature and also sort of biological feedbacks that maintain either alternative state. A similar process can happen in arid environments where they can often be either dominated by sort of grass species or a more desertified shrubland dominated state. And this is quite important because these regime shifts can be accompanied by major changes in ecosystem services, such as like carbon storage, water quality, or like soil erosion. And there can also be losses of economic value from things like grazing, fisheries, and sort of other use, ecotourism, and other uses of these ecosystems. So to think about this question, we started looking at, rather than those simulated data sets, some empirical data sets. And one of the first ones we looked at was this sort of long-term monitoring data set. I keep kind of flashing up on my different slides, documenting the abundances of perennial grasses versus sort of shrub species in an experimental rangeland in New Mexico. And this sort of exhibits this regime change from a sort of grassland-dominated to a shrub-dominated state in around the year 1950. And this was caused by a sort of major period of drought that occurred during that time. So there's significant declines in precipitation and increases in pressure that actually had to do with conditions in the Pacific Ocean. And that caused this long and, importantly, persistent shift, even though the sort of abiotic conditions or physical conditions of the system returned to their states before the regime shift occurred, the biology didn't. And one of the reasons people think that we had this sort of shock in terms of the physics of the system influencing the biology in a persistent way is that sort of grasses in these arid rangelands can modify the conditions to improve their level of persistence. So when there's lots of grasses around, essentially rainfall is much more likely to infiltrate into the soil, so increasing soil moisture levels. Whereas when they're less persistent, it'll run off and erode, reducing soil moisture levels. And so if they go away, they can't necessarily come back. So we developed two universal differential equation models, one that tried to explicitly incorporate this feedback mechanism between plants and soil conditions, and another one that only included sort of physical constraints on the system. So essentially the data set tracks the percentage of space covered by different species, so we imposed a constraint that everything had to add up to 1. And so we trained these two different models on those data sets using the state space modeling approach. And the next thing we did was we used those trained models to generate bifurcation diagrams. And so what these do is they track a variable, so in this case precipitation, along the x-axis, and along the y-axis is the equilibrium density of a species predicted by the model. So you set the right-hand side of the differential equation to 0, and you solve using a nonlinear solver. And the different panels show the different species that we used in these models, and then the different rows show the two different UDE models that we tested. And we found that they both were able to recover this potential for regime shifts in the system with a high abundance equilibrium of grasses and a low abundance equilibrium. And very qualitatively similar bifurcation diagrams for the grass species, and then fairly different looking ones for the other species included in the system. So it seems like these methods are able to recover this potentially quite important form of nonlinear dynamics from time series data. The other thing we wanted to know is if you could figure out if regime shifts were going to occur before the sort of tipping point actually was crossed. So this tipping point's crossed around 1950, where you get this transition from a grassland-dominated state to a desert-type state. And we just constructed some data sets by leaving off the end of the data there. And we trained the model sort of moving up along each of these data sets. So that's starting at the top of this figure, moving down to the bottom, and looked to see what kinds of bifurcation diagrams were predicted, where the sort of tipping point between these two alternative stable states was. And what we found was that the model with more sort of mechanistic information and structure in it, UD2, predicted where the sort of tipping point between these two regimes was much more consistently than the one that only included the physical constraints. Yeah, this jumped to this. Okay. The other thing that we did was we ran just leave future out cross-validation to see how well these two different models forecasted. And we did this twice. We did one set of training sets just based on the end of the time series. And then we did another one where the training sets were mostly constructed or the testing sets were mostly constructed around that regime shift. And we found, we compared the two universal differential equation models to basically a linear time series model. And the UDEs, the more flexible universal differential equation model that didn't include all the mechanisms was the most effective at making forecasts. So in terms of our big picture questions, what we found was that sort of universal differential equations can be quite nice for predicting regime changes from ecosystem time series data. It seemed like including additional mechanistic information in the model improved the model's ability to detect where tipping points were in the data set. but more flexible UDEs that are primarily learned from data seem to be better at forecasting. So there's a bit of a trade-off there. We also have other people in our group trying to think about this sort of coral reef macroalgae transition that's sort of really determined by sort of fish populations. But they've been a lot more ambitious, and they're looking at sort of global data sets with a global scope, and they're looking at a lot of additional drivers that are really important for coral reefs. So this is still sort of in the works. Another sort of piece of future work that I'm really excited about that'd be cool to get people's feedback on is thinking about how to scale these models up to really, really large data sets. So we have a lot of satellite-based remote sensing data is often highly relevant, and that can lead to data sets with potentially, this is like a 30-meter resolution data set that's global, so millions of data points. We're also interested in understanding harmful algal blooms in lakes. And again, these sort of satellite-based data sets are great for that. Yeah, finally, we're working on essentially trying to get a front end going for these tools to allow other people in our field to use them efficiently. Lots of people in ecology already use, like R is kind of the main thing that people use for making figures and analyzing data sets. So we want to get these functions basically from our Julia package to be accessible there. So we're using the R to Julia to do that. And yeah, we want to make sure we're generating sort of new methods for training these models that are sort of that deal with a lot of the realities and limitations of the data that we have to work with. And yeah, with that, I'll wrap up a bit early. But
any questions for the speaker? Yes.
Hi. Thank you for the talk. I have a question. You mentioned some training techniques with gradient matching. In that case, when you're estimating the gradients from data, what do you use to avoid noisy gradients? So I assume that you mentioned that your data is very noisy, so I assume that if you were to try to do gradients naively from that, it would be impossible to use because you would have very much.
Yeah, so you end up having to fit sort of smoothing functions that have some form of regularization. So I have one implementation going that uses interpolations.jl to do some of the like nonlinear or this like smooth curve fitting type approach. So there's a penalty term on the derivative to keep it from, yeah, so you get a nice smooth curve rather than, yeah, something that just runs through each of those data points and gives you a very noisy gradient. Another thing that you can do is you can estimate that smoothing curve and then you can penalize it to have to match the derivatives predicted by the model. If that, I'm not sure. So you simultaneously train the neural network and fit the smoothing curve to the data, and you add a penalty term so that the derivatives of the UD model have to match the derivatives in the smoothing curve, and that'll simultaneously train the UD model to match the data, and it will regularize the smoothing curve. And that method seems to work the best. It runs really fast, and it deals with some of the noise issues. So that's something we're still kind of working on, figuring out the best way to implement it. I've seen some things where you'll use a neural network to learn this basically smoothing function, and then another one to learn the derivatives. We've been finding just like basically like B-splines, so like polynomial spline works pretty well too.
Okay, are there any other questions for the speaker? I have a question. Since your systems are inherently much more uncertain, more variable than the typical engineering applications that we often see in these SciML talks, do you think it would be useful to also apply these methods to like stochastic differential equations or these jump problems that are also present in the SciML ecosystem?
Yeah, I think something we should probably be working on is particularly like the jump problems. So there's a lot of models, a lot of theoretical models in ecology will use something called like a pulse-impulsive model or a jump differential equation to account for like seasonality, because a lot of species in the life history will have like a pulse event where they release a bunch of like propagules into the environment or something along those lines. We've thought about trying to implement this stuff with stochastic differential equations as well. And the sort of state space method we've worked on, I think, is a good sort of pragmatic in between where you don't necessarily have to simulate lots of individual trajectories. The other thing is that sort of smoothing curve method I was telling you about if you pick the order of your B-spline correctly, it ends up actually being approximate inference for stochastic differential equations, depending on how you set up the algorithm. And you don't have to ever deal with an ODE solver. You just match derivatives of a smoothing function and the UDE model. So that's kind of one way of approaching it.
Okay. Any other questions for the speaker? Otherwise, let's give another round of applause, and then the next speaker can prepare.